At that moment, high above a continent at war, the sky was not silent. It was alive with the distant hum of engines, the thin white scars of contrails stretching across the cold blue horizon. Men on the ground believed they understood what was coming. They had seen it before. Slow, heavy bombers, predictable, vulnerable, doomed. Inside a command room in Berlin, confidence held firm. The mathematics of past battles seemed clear. Without fighter escort, no bomber formation could survive deep inside German airspace. It had been proven in blood just months earlier. The strategy was simple: wait, strike, destroy. And then something appeared that should not have existed. Small, fast-moving shapes, barely visible at first. Not bombers, not formations that made sense. Single-engine fighters flying alongside the bombers, protecting them all the way to Berlin. It was not just unexpected. It was impossible. Because no fighter in the world was supposed to have that kind of range. Yet they were there. Silver aircraft weaving through the sky with quiet precision, rewriting the rules of air combat in real time. In that instant, the question was no longer about tactics or courage or even technology. It became something far more unsettling. If the impossible was now possible, what else had already changed? And more importantly, had the outcome of the war already been decided long before anyone realized it? The roots of that moment stretched back months, shaped not by a single decision, but by a series of painful lessons learned in the skies over Europe. The American strategy of daylight precision bombing had always carried a dangerous assumption that tightly packed formations of bombers, bristling with defensive guns, could protect themselves deep betuck enemy territory. For a time, that belief held. Then came the missions over Schweinfurt and 1943. Unescorted bombers flying into the heart of Germany were met by waves of interceptors. The result was devastating. Dozens of aircraft were lost in a single raid. Crews were killed, captured, or simply vanished into the cold air above Europe. The message was clear. Without long-range escort, the concept of daylight bombing was not just flawed, it was unsustainable. And so, both sides adjusted. The Luftwaffe refined its interception doctrine. They would wait until the bombers pushed deep into German airspace, far beyond the reach of Allied fighters. Then they would strike with speed and precision. Head-on attacks, heavy armament. Short bursts of overwhelming force. It was efficient, proven, deadly. On the morning of March 6th, 1944, everything seemed to align with that expectation. From airfields across eastern England, hundreds of aircraft lifted into the sky. Long lines of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators formed into disciplined streams, climbing steadily toward 25,000 feet. Around them, fighter escorts gathered, but only for part of the journey. That had always been the limit. Fuel dictated everything. As the formation crossed the Dutch coast and entered German airspace, radar stations began tracking them. Inside command centers, calculations were already being made. Distances, timing, interception windows. By all known logic, the bombers were now alone. But at 12:37 p.m., that logic collapsed. The radar screens told a different story. The small contacts were still there, fast, persistent, moving with the bombers, not turning back. 60 miles west of Berlin, where no escort should have remained, the fighters were still present, still protecting, still impossible. In that moment, what had once been a reliable system of defense began to fracture, not because of a sudden failure in skill or courage, but because the assumptions behind it were no longer true. And when assumptions fail in war, the consequences rarely unfold slowly. They arrive all at once. At 12:50 p.m., the order was given. Every available fighter in the Berlin defense zone was to scramble. Engines roared to life across multiple airfields as Bf-109S and Fu-190S lifted into the sky, climbing hard to meet the incoming formations. Around 160 aircraft were committed to the interception. The plan was familiar. Ignore the escorts, break through, destroy the bombers. It had worked before. Head-on attacks were the preferred method. Fast approach from high altitude, a short burst of cannon fire, then disengage age before defensive gunners could respond. It was a tactic built on precision and timing, refined through years of combat. Against unescorted bombers, it was devastating. But this time, the sky was different. At approximately 1:05 p.m., the first German formations made contact nearly 40 miles west of Berlin. Major units began their attack runs, aligning for the familiar approach. The bombers held formation, steady and disciplined, their defensive guns ready, and then, without warning, the escorts struck. From above, where they held the advantage, a group of P-51 Mustangs dove into the German formation. They did not wait. They did not hesitate. Using speed gained from altitude, they closed the distance before the interceptors could react. Within seconds, the carefully organized attack dissolved into chaos. Pilots who had expected to fire on bombers suddenly found themselves under attack. The difference was immediate and unforgiving. The Mustangs held both altitude and speed. They chose when to engage and when to disengage. German fighters, already committed to their attack paths, were caught in vulnerable positions. Formations broke apart, communication faltered. The timing that had once made their tactics effective now worked against them. In less than 2 minutes, several aircraft were already falling. Smoke trails cut through the sky as damaged fighters spiraled downward. Others attempted to regroup, but the rhythm of the battle had been broken. The bombers, still intact, continued forward. Their formation held. Their mission remained unchanged. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was not dictating the terms of the engagement. They were reacting to it. And in air combat, that shift from control to reaction often determines the outcome long before the battle itself is over. By the time the battle reached its full intensity, the outcome was no longer in doubt for those who could see the broader picture. From his aircraft, climbing over the outskirts of Berlin, the scene unfolded with a clarity that no report could capture. Contrails stretched in every direction, marking the invisible paths of machines locked in conflict far above the ground. The bombers moved forward in tight, disciplined formations, and above them, almost effortlessly, the escorts maintained control. Every attempt to break through was met with resistance. German fighters climbed, turned, and accelerated, trying to find an opening. But at high altitude, their machines were no longer performing as they once had. Engines struggled where they had once thrived, power dropped, climb rates slowed. The margin for error narrowed with every passing second. The difference lay not in bravery, nor in experience, but in performance. At these altitudes, the engines powering the American fighters retained their strength. They could sustain speed, they could climb with confidence, and most importantly, they could choose the moment of engagement. German aircraft, by contrast, were forced into reactive maneuvers, often beginning the fight already at a disadvantage. It was a quiet imbalance, but a decisive one. Below, the bombers pressed on toward their targets: industrial centers, factories, infrastructure that sustained the war effort. The sound of explosions would soon echo across Berlin, but the more critical battle had already been decided in the air above. Loss reports began to arrive: fighters destroyed, pilots missing, formations broken before they could even reach firing range. The numbers were not just concerning, they were unsustainable. Each loss carried weight beyond the aircraft itself. Experienced pilots could not be replaced quickly. Training took time Germany no longer had, and the attackers would return, again and again. As the sky slowly cleared and the formations turned back toward England, one reality became unavoidable. This was no longer a contest that could be won through tactical adjustments alone. No new formation, no revised approach angle, no act of individual skill could reverse what was happening. The balance had shifted too far. What remained was not a question of how to win, but how long the inevitable could be delayed. In the aftermath of the mission, the deeper truth began to emerge, not in the smoke over Berlin, but in the numbers quietly compiled behind the front lines. This was no longer a battle defined by individual encounters in the sky. It had become a contest of systems, of production lines, training programs, fuel supplies, and industrial capacity measured not in theory, but in output. On one side stood an economy fully mobilized for war. Factories operated without pause, day and night, producing aircraft engines with a level of precision and consistency that ensured every machine performed exactly as expected. Pilots were trained extensively, accumulating hundreds of flight hours before ever entering combat. Fuel, high grade and abundant, allowed for sustained operations without compromise. On the other side, the situation was increasingly fragile. Aircraft production continued, but under constant pressure. Facilities were dispersed, relocated, sometimes forced underground to avoid destruction. This fragmentation came at a cost. Quality varied. Output fluctuated. Materials became scarce. Every engine, every airframe carried a degree of uncertainty. The difference extended beyond machines. Pilot training programs, once rigorous, were shortened out of necessity. New pilots entered combat with limited experience, facing opponents who had trained longer and operated under more stable conditions. Losses, once manageable, began to compound. Experienced crews could not be replaced at the rate they were being lost. Fuel shortages added another layer of constraint. Operations had to be rationed, training flights reduced, tactical flexibility diminished. Even when aircraft were available, the ability to deploy them effectively was no longer guaranteed. Every decision became a calculation of scarcity. And then there was the matter of scale. The opposing force was not simply replacing its losses, it was expanding, producing more aircraft, training more pilots, sustaining longer missions. The gap widened with each passing month, not dramatically at first, but steadily, relentlessly. In this context, the events of March 6th were not an isolated failure. They were a visible symptom of a much larger imbalance. A realization began to take hold among those responsible for directing the air war. This was no longer a question of adapting tactics or refining strategy. The limitations were structural. Even perfect decisions could not compensate for deficits in production, training, and resources. It was, in the most fundamental sense, a matter of arithmetic. And the arithmetic no longer favored Germany. Years later, when the war had ended and the noise of engines and gunfire had faded into memory, the significance of that day remained unchanged. It was not remembered solely for the bombs that fell on Berlin, nor for the aircraft that failed to return. Those were, in many ways, expected in a conflict of that scale. What endured was something less visible, yet far more decisive, the moment when the structure of the air war itself was revealed to be broken beyond repair. The introduction of long-range fighter escort did more than protect bombers. It removed the last layer of strategic depth. There were no longer safe distances, no unreachable targets, no protected industries operating beyond the range of attack. Every critical node became vulnerable, not occasionally, but continuously. And with that, the tempo of the war changed. Air superiority, once contested, shifted toward inevitability. Not because of a single aircraft design or a single decision, but because multiple systems had aligned engineering, production, training, and logistics, all reinforcing one another. The result was not dramatic in a single moment, but overwhelming over time. For those who observed it closely, the conclusion was unavoidable. The outcome had already been decided, not in the skies over Berlin, but in the factories, training fields, and supply chains that made such missions possible. What appeared in the air on that March afternoon was simply the visible proof of a deeper reality. In the years that followed, this lesson would be studied, analyzed, and repeated in different forms. The idea that modern warfare extends far beyond the battlefield, that it is shaped as much by industry and organization as by tactics and bravery, became impossible to ignore. The aircraft themselves would fade into history. The names, the units, the individual encounters, many would be remembered only by specialists and historians. But the principle remained. Wars of that scale are not won by isolated victories. They are decided by systems that can endure, adapt, and expand faster than their opponents. And on that day, high above Berlin, that principle was no longer theoretical. It was undeniable. If you found this story meaningful, consider how many turning points in history were not recognized in the moment they occurred. Sometimes The most decisive shifts are not marked by sudden endings, but by quiet realizations seen clearly only in hindsight. And perhaps the most important question is not when a war ends, but when it truly becomes impossible to win.